Good afternoon to all of you, and thank you so much for joining us today. This online event is organized by Nordregio, which is an international research center on regional development and planning. And in just a moment, we will present a fresh report on Nordic climate policies. My name is Kirsi Heikel. I will moderate this event. This report we have just published is a part of the Nordic Vision 2030 that aims at making the Nordic countries the most sustainable and integrated region in the world. I'm sure most of you have heard of this vision that was set by the Nordic Prime Ministers 4 years ago. And reaching carbon neutrality without impacting some groups more than others is vital for that vision. So researchers have now analyzed what impact do climate change policies have on Nordic economies, industries, and households. And the results give us plenty of hope and reason for optimism. So indeed, it's great to have so many of you joining us online in this event. And our agenda today is that shortly, Nora Sanchez-Gassen from Nordregio will talk more about the background on this report. And after that, Peter Dixon and Maureen from Victoria University, Melbourne will present the results and tell us about the modeling they have created and used in this study. And then we will bring in perspectives from experts. We're so happy that we have with us here today Professor Emeritus of International Economies, Flam from Sweden. We have also advisory specialist Jóhannes Bjarki Tómasson from Iceland's Environment Agency, economist and modeler Vincent Otto at Konjunkturinstitutet in Sweden, and Mattias Goldman, who is founder of the Swedish Secretariat 2030, and he is focused on transport issues. And we have also Juha Honkatukia from Finland. He is one of the economists involved in this research, and he has published extensive on the topic of climate change policy. So these are our experts and speakers today, and we're happy to take your questions and your comments. You can send them via chat. Carlos Tapia, senior researcher at Nordregio, will be moderating the chat. And maybe just a couple of things about the chat before we start. We will select the most relevant questions. Just please be clear about who your question is for. And if we don't have time to answer all of your questions here at this event, our researchers will do their best to answer in the chat. So why don't we start with the background? Senior Research Fellow Nora Sanchez-Gassen from Nordregio. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Kirsi. Hello, everyone, also from me. Welcome here in this webinar. My name is Nora Sanchez-Gassen. I'm a Senior Research Fellow at Nordregio, and I've been coordinating this project that we are discussing today on the impact of climate policies in our Nordic countries. With me on the coordination team was Carlos Tapia. As Kirsi said, he's moderating the chat and ready to answer your questions there and discuss with you. The project that we are dealing with today, that we are discussing today, is financed and owned by the Nordic Council of Ministers, and more precisely by 5 sectors at the Nordic Council of Ministers. Finance sector, regional sector, labor market sector, the sector for research and education, and the sector for environment and climate. Many different sectors focusing on many different areas. And you might wonder, why is it that so many sectors have come together to fund and support this project? Well, I think it is because we discuss a very timely and important topic here. We are essentially dealing with climate change and the green transition in the Nordic countries. We all know that climate change is one of the, perhaps the most pressing challenge that we have to address in the Nordic countries in the years and also decades to come. To address climate change, we need to bring down greenhouse gas emissions. And to achieve that, a lot of changes will be necessary. We will have to change the way we produce, we have to change the way we consume, how we travel, how we heat our homes. Many far-reaching changes will be necessary that will affect all of us. And one key question that Kirsi already mentioned is, how can we achieve all of these changes without making sure that no one is left behind? How can we make sure that everyone can profit from the benefits of the green transition? How can we make sure that potential burdens don't fall much more strongly on some groups than on others? Well, to discuss these questions and to plan for it, we need to know how climate policies actually work, what kind of impact they actually have. And this is where our project tried to make a contribution. So we've selected 3 climate policy areas. We look at biofuel, we will look at electric vehicles, and we look at phasing out of coal as an energy carrier. We look at these 3 climate areas. We have looked at what kind of goals and targets the Nordic countries have committed to in those areas. And then we look at what the impacts of those policies will actually be if we achieve those targets. And we look at very different impacts on economic growth, on our industries, on households, on employment. Now, the whole project focuses on the time period 2019 to 2030. This means we look at impacts up till 2030. We look forward into the future. We start in 2019, and you may wonder why 2019? That's a couple of years back already. Well, the reason here is that to do the modeling we wanted to do in this project, we need good and reliable economic data. And we could have used data from 2020 or 2021, but we know that those were pandemic years, quite exceptional years. And that is perhaps not the best basis for economic modeling. So we went back to 2019, used the data from this year, and based our analysis on the data in that year. But this also means, and that's quite important, this also means that we looked at what kind of climate policy commitments the Nordic countries had actually done in that year. What were the commitments the Nordic countries had signed up to in 2019 when it comes to biofuel, when it comes to electric vehicles, most notably. Now, this is important to keep in mind because we know that this is a bit of a moving target. The targets that we have now in the Nordic countries are not necessarily the same ones we had in 2019. We know that in a few Nordic countries, ambition levels have gone down. So this is important for you to keep in mind when you later listen to the results. Keep in mind, these are the goals from 2019 we've looked at, which are at least partly a bit more ambitious than what we have today. To do all these analysis, Peter Dixon, Maureen Rimmer, also Jóhannes and the whole team behind it have created a new Nordic model that I also want to highlight, the Nordic term model. It's an economic model, a computable general equilibrium model, which represents the 5 Nordic countries plus Åland. It's a very complex, very ambitious model that allows us to look at industries, at employment, at households, at a national and at a regional level. So we can really use this model to look in depth at impacts, and we can compare across the Nordic countries. And I think this is a nice Nordic output of this project. Before we listen to Peter and hear more about the results, I just very briefly wanted to acknowledge the team behind the whole project, which has taken more than 2 years. We have some of us here, Peter Dixon, Maureen Rimmer in Australia. We have Jóhannes who will join the panel later on. I mentioned my colleague Carlos Tapia, who was moderating the chat. But we also had information from colleagues behind the scenes. We had Fredrik Mar Baldursson from Reykjavik University, who supplied us with information on Icelandic policies. We had a whole team from the Center for Regional and Tourism Research in Denmark who helped us with Danish policies. These were Jens Clausen, Jonathan Lindahl, and Jakob Rasmussen. And we had Elin Siragren, our colleague here, and the whole communications team here at Nordregio who helped us publish the report and organize the event. Last but not least, I want to acknowledge Jukka Kinnunen. Jukka was research director at OSUP, that is the Statistical and Research Office on Åland, and Jukka was centrally involved in developing the idea for this project, and he also would have led our whole research effort. But very sadly, Jukka passed away very unexpectedly just as we were about to start this work. So while he could not join us in this work in practice, here in his memory, we wanted to acknowledge that he was centrally involved in really starting the whole project. And with that, back to you, Kirsi.
Thank you, Nora, so much for the background. And yeah, it's time to hear about the results and about the model you mentioned. We're happy and honored that these very experienced top researchers have been involved. And Professor Peter Dixon is a well-known Australian economist. He has published several books and more than 200 academic papers on economic modeling and economic policy analysis. And Professor Maureen Rimmer, also a world-class expert in model development and application, and model she has created is, for instance, used by the US International Trade Commission. So Peter and Maureen, please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Kirsi. Now we've got the slides ready to go. Maureen's going to operate the slides. Yes, here we go. All right.
Oops. Yeah.
There we go. All right. Nora's already told you about the modelling team. There's the list on that front page. We'll go to the second slide. So the assignment for the modelling team was to quantify the distributional effects. So I emphasise distributional effects of Nordic greenhouse discretionary policies. Those are the ones that are not mandated through agreements with the EU. So the policies required by 2030 increases in the bio content of motor fuels, large-scale electrification of the car fleets, and we also included the phase out of remaining coal-fired electricity generations that mainly affects Denmark. And our central modelling tool, as Nora mentioned, is a model called Nordic Term. So let me tell you a bit about Nordic Term. Okay, these happy researchers pictured there, Mark Horridge and Lynn Whitwer, they are the primary developers of the term methodology. The term methodology, that stands for the enormous regional model. So the term methodology is used to convert national or multinational models into models with subnational regions. And those of you who are familiar with multi-country modelling, you can think of these term models as the countries become subnational regions that trade with each other, and there is flows of factors, labour and capital between them. Okay, so Glenn Whitwer worked hard on this project, and he made a master database identifying 74 industries in each of 328 NUTS2 regions in 40 countries, predominantly in Europe. Now, that's far too much for one model, but the database can be aggregated into configurations useful for each project. And for Nordic Term, the model that we made out of Glenn's database, we chose to have 53 industries. We had 27 industries, which consist of 27 regions, consisting of the 26 NUTS2 regions in the 5 Nordic countries, plus the rest of EU. So here's a picture of them all. All right. So there's Iceland. We know more about geography than, that's not quite the right place to put it, but there it is. It's just got one region, right? And then there's Finland. I think it's got 5 regions marked in there, and then there's Norway's got 7, and so on. Anyway, altogether, the model identifies the 26 NUTS regions in the 5 Nordic countries, and then it's got the rest of Europe. All right. Now, remember that we're interested in distributional effects. So term models generate results for macro and industry variables at the national and regional levels. But for this model, we added on programs that extend the results to cover the effects of policies on employment in 37 occupations, employment in 4 educational requirements, employment by 7 wage bands, employment by 6 age groups, cost of living for families by income decile and location, that's urban, intermediate and rural, and we also put in CO2 emissions. Right, now, so remember there were 3 policies that we looked at. So the first was 3, so we had to make 3 sets of shocks for our model. So the first policies were to do with achieving biofuel targets. That involves increasing the cost of motor fuels to industries, mainly the road transport industry, and to households. Why increasing the cost? Because the biomaterials are more expensive than the fossil fuel materials. And it involves changing the composition of inputs to the production of what we call motor fuels, which is the substitution of biomaterials for fossil fuels, oil in particular. And this table shows the targets that we assumed for Denmark, not much of a target, going from 6 to 7%. That's biofuel percent in motor fuels. Finland from 11 to 30, Sweden from 23 to 63. And we estimated that these switches, or the achieving these targets, would increase the price of diesel blend, say for Sweden, by 56%, right? And it would increase the price of the fuels used by households for Sweden, say, by 36%. You can see all the percentages there. Right. The second set of back one. Yep. The second set of targets cover increases in the share of the passenger motor vehicle fleets accounted for by electric vehicles. And you can see there that for, say, Sweden, in 2020, the share was 6.2% of the passenger cars were electric vehicles, and the aim is to increase that to 48%. And this will, we had to take into account then in modelling that this will reduce the household use of electricity. Where's that? Oh, that's sorry, increase the house. No, try again. It's 10 o'clock at night here, I'm sorry. Percentage change in 2030 in household consumption of motor fuels falls sharply. You can see that minus 44.6%, because you're replacing the fueled cars by electricity. And there's an increase in the use of electricity by households. And each country, the households in each country have to spend money on charging stations, and here's the estimates we made of the cost of new charging stations in the year 2030. So it's not the accumulated cost, it's how much they're spending in 2030. So that's, for Sweden, that's 547 million euro. All right, the last set of shocks is to do with the phasing out of coal-fired electricity generation, and that's as I said, mainly affects Denmark. And so that phase-out policy reduced the percent loss of capital in Denmark through scrapping of the remaining coal-fired electricity generation. Is 0.65% of their total capital stock is sacrificed that way. All right, so those are the shocks. Now, here are the macroeconomic results. All right, so small GDP losses arise mainly from increased cost of motor fuels. So you can see there the GDP losses across that first line. What that means is, the biggest one's for Sweden again. What that means is that in 2030, because of these policies, GDP in Sweden is 1.31% less than it otherwise would have been. Is that a lot or a little? Well, Sweden's actually got good growth prospects. So by 2030, we expect GDP in Sweden to be about, in the baseline, was about 20% bigger than it was in 2019. So that means instead of growing by 20%, Swedish GDP grows by, what's that, about 18.7%. Right, so these are small numbers, especially in the context of growing economies. What else are we supposed to see here? Well, so some of these macro results are quite important for understanding the industry results. So we'll try to explain them a little bit. So we've got small losses in GDP. Terms of trade fall for DK, that's Denmark, and for Iceland, and rise for Finland, Sweden, and Norway, explained mainly by trade in motor fuels. Now, what's the terms of trade? The terms of trade refers to the price of exports relative to the price of imports. Now, the main price change that's going on is the price of motor fuels, and Denmark and Iceland import motor fuels, and to a much greater extent than they export them. So those two countries, they suffer a bit of a terms of trade decline. On the other hand, Finland, Sweden and Norway export motor fuels, and so they have a terms of trade win. Now, a relatively strong terms of trade movement means that you can consume or absorb more than you produce. So you can see there that the declines in real GNE for the countries that have terms of trade improvements, the declines in their real GNEs are smaller than the declines in their GDP. See, that's for Finland, 1% down on GNE. That's what they absorb, the consumption, investment and government spending. And the decline in GDP is 1.16. For Denmark, it's the other way around. A bigger decline in what's absorbed than the decline in GDP. Now, if you have a terms of trade decline, then it's likely that you'll have real exchange rate devaluation. That means that you've got to become more competitive to make up for that terms of trade decline. And so you can see that Denmark and Iceland have relatively strong real exchange rate declines, and that favours their export-oriented industries. And there are reductions in the real wage rates in all countries, right? So why should real wage rates fall? Well, you've made one of the costs of meeting greenhouse targets is that you've got to use more expensive methods, in this case to make motor fuels. That reduces the value of the marginal product of labour, and wages have to adjust down a little bit. But they're still quite small declines, especially in the background of a growing economy. All right, so with all that in place, then we can go to the distributional and industry effects and so on. So we're going to project the effects on industry outputs. There are direct effects, like using forestry products to make motor fuels. So that's going to be good for the forestry industry. That's sort of a direct effect. There are indirect macro effects coming from what happens to the real exchange rate, what happens to the competitiveness of the country. The industry output effects, they're the main determinant of the employment by industry, but there are also some technology effects. For instance, we'll see that the output of motor fuels actually falls because motor fuels gets more expensive, but at the same time, employment of people making motor fuels goes up because you need more people if you're going to make motor fuels out of biomaterials than if you're going to make motor fuels out of fossil fuels. Okay, now once we get employment by industry in place, then we can go from employment to employment by occupation, and we can go to employment by wage band, age, education, and employment by industry also tells us a lot about what happens to employment in those nuts to regional economies. Right, so here's a few. Now there are lots and lots of, there's lots and lots of examples. Here's a few industries where the employment effects are predominantly from the direct impact of the shocks. Okay, crops. That's an input to motor fuels in DK. So you can see there that for the crop industry, these policies are a positive. Okay, that's for Denmark. There's a loss of competitiveness in Finland, Sweden and Iceland related to intensive use of motor fuels in the crops industry. So for Finland, Sweden and Norway, Iceland, Finland, Sweden and Iceland, we assume, well, Iceland doesn't make much in the way of motor fuels anyway, but for Finland and Sweden, we assume that the biofuel will come mainly out of the forestry and logs industry, and you can see their big stimulation of employment for forestry and logs in Finland and Sweden. Wood products. Why does wood products do poorly in Finland and Sweden? Well, the forestry and logging input, which has got more expensive because it's been taken off to make the biofuels. Right, motor fuels, I mentioned before, the motor fuels, the output actually falls, but employment in motor fuels goes sharply up because in switching to the biofuels, you need more labour and capital per unit of output, as well as the forestry products. And electrical equipment there, well, that's the charging stations. See stimulation there. Right, so now we look quickly at some employment effects that arise mainly through macro, right? So paper products, it does poorly in Finland and Sweden because one of its inputs, which is forestry and logging products, it gets more expensive, right? And that's a highly traded commodity, so it loses competitiveness in Finland and Sweden. At the same time, it gains competitiveness in Denmark and does rather well. Chemical products, it gains competitive. Remember that in Denmark, the real exchange rate moved down a bit, so trade-exposed industries like chemical products do rather well in Denmark, but poorly in Finland and Sweden, exacerbated by the fact that the chemical products industry uses a lot of motor fuels in Finland and Sweden. What are all these negatives for public administration and defence, education, health and social services, all these little negatives? Well, they are macroeconomic effects. Greenhouse policies, it turns out that they're not very expensive, but they are expensive, I mean, if you know what I mean. So you can't solve the greenhouse problem for nothing. So the economies in 2030 are a little bit smaller than they otherwise would have been, not seriously smaller than they otherwise would have been, and they're going to be bigger than they were in 2019. There's plenty of background growth going on, but they'll be so the greenhouse policies are paid for in a way by having less public administration and defence, a little bit less of education, a little bit less in health and social services. So that's really the costs of the greenhouse policies. Right. Now, from there, we can spill out what happens to all of the occupations. Here's a few selected occupations. You can see there, if you go to the bottom there, that's percent deviations. So employment of health professionals is down 1% in Denmark, down 0.8% in Finland, 0.9%. But go to the no policy baseline, and you can see that health professional employment is growing quite strongly, in fact, very strongly, between 2019 and 2030 in the baseline. All this means is that the employment of health professionals grows a little bit slower than it otherwise would have done. You can see for the agriculture, forestry, and fishing in the baseline, employment in those sorts of occupations is contracting quite strongly. In fact, the greenhouse policy is rather good for these occupations and means that they don't contract nearly as strongly as they otherwise would have done. Right, so that's a helpful smoothing of a slight structural adjustment problem. Okay, what's next? Now, we tried very hard to find problems with employment. You say wage bands. Do these policies favour high-paid occupations or low-paid occupations? Answer: almost no effect. All right, so there are some high-paid occupations that benefit, some low-paid occupations that benefit, and vice versa. Almost no effect. Right, what's next? Maureen are always we're quite interested in the employment prospects for the +60s, even the +70s group. Anyway, there's not much in this. a lot of very small effects. It doesn't discriminate between old people and young people. What's next? Education. Well, there's, again, very dull results. There's a slight bias against all those medical people with their high education, government service, high education, but it's tiny, very small effects. And now this rather messy slide, this gives the results for the regions. Now I'm going to try to do something a little bit complicated here, and then I'll be nearly finished, I think. Look, try Sweden. All right. Now, through this period, we expect employment in Sweden as a whole to grow by 2.72%. All right. So SE11, that's the employment grows quicker. They've got a slightly favourable mix of industries. So employment in our baseline grows quicker than for Sweden as a whole. This policy actually favours employment in SE11. So with the policy in place, employment grows by 3% instead of 2.8, and so the deviation is 0.9. So there's an example of 0.19. So there's an example of a region which already had pretty good growth prospects and gets better growth prospects. So we call that a case of accentuation. Now, what we really want is case of smoothing. And a case of smoothing is SE21. That region had below average prospects, below average for Sweden. The policy is good for that region, and so that helps a slow growing region. So we call that a case of smoothing. So it turns out if you go through all of this stuff, there are 25 cases there. 25 little regions, and in 15 cases the policy is quite helpful. It smooths out, it increases growth in a slow growing region, it reduces growth in a fast growing region, and in 10 cases it's this accentuation. It increases growth in an already fast growing region and reduces growth in a slow growing region. But again, the general theme is that the effects are small. What's next? Right, here's what people often think of is cost of living results. And across the top, DO1, DO2 to D10, across the top, these are deciles. So the poorest people or families are in DO1 and the richest are in D10. All right, and then for each of Denmark, Finland and Sweden, we didn't have data for Iceland or Norway, but for each of Denmark, Finland and Sweden, we worked on what happened to the cost of living for urban households, intermediate and rural. Remember, the main thing that's happening is we're increasing the cost of motor fuels, and that, of course, increases the costs of all the things that use motor fuels and so on. So what happens to the cost of living for the different families in different income groups in the different regions? Now, the outstanding result is that rural families, their cost of living increases relative to the cost of living of the other types of families. And that's right across the board, right across all the deciles. But again, the story is always that it's really small, and it's not particularly regressive or progressive. You can see that even for the rural families, the effect, say, for Denmark is 0.07. That means that the cost of living for rural families increases for poor rural families increases by 0.07% relative to the cost of living for all the families in Denmark as a whole. So it's 0.07, 0.03, 0.21. See, it's not systematic across the income groups, so it's not progressive. It's definitely rural because they consume more motor fuels than other types of families, but it's definitely rural, but it's nothing. It's not necessarily rich or poor, right? And as I keep on emphasising, the really important thing is that the results is that they're very small, right? Now here are the emissions results. If you look at emissions, CO2 equivalent emissions in the 5 countries in 1990, call that 1. By 2019, those for Denmark, it was reduced to 0.65, Finland out of 0.77 and so on. With no policy, no extra policy, without these policies that we've been discussing, by 2030, emissions for Denmark would be up to 0.72, for Finland up to 0.86, reflecting growth in the Nordic economies. With the greenhouse policies in place, emissions for Denmark come from 0.72 down to 0.67, for Finland from 0.86 to 0.62 and so on. All right, so the announced targets for emission targets for 2030 are those things down here, 0.45 for Denmark, 0.57 for Finland, 0.63 for Sweden and so on. So what we conclude from that, well, these policies that we're looking at are sufficient to, in fact, go through the target for Sweden. But remember that the targets for Sweden, especially for both for the motor fuels and the electric vehicles, were really quite ambitious. So Sweden, if they can achieve those targets, also meet their greenhouse gas targets through these policies. For the other countries, there's still a bit of work to do. All right. So what's the conclusion? Well, here's the conclusion. With the exception of Sweden, the policies we've analysed will not be sufficient to achieve Nordic greenhouse targets for 2030. Nevertheless, for 2 reasons, our results support an optimistic conclusion. The first reason is that the policies will cause significant reductions in greenhouse emissions at very moderate macro cost. You remember that's those sort of 1% GDP sort of numbers. The policies imply that significant reductions in emissions can be achieved with very little structural disruption. So the modelling teams left rather no stone unturned. They looked for a problem and didn't find one. All right, all those dimensions of employment, regional, occupational, high wage, low wage, educational, different types of families and different income classes and so on. The results do not support, well, we didn't find any important structural problem. Now, so would you say that these CGE, the computer general equilibrium results, are dull? Well, I say yes, but they're still important because dull results like this can be used as an argument against people who oppose, and this has been very true in Australia, sensible environmental policies have been opposed over and over again on the grounds that they might be unfair, that there is some group that's going to lose. And unless you have results analysis of this type, you're left rather defenceless against those sorts of arguments. So I think that's our story. We'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Professor Peter Dixon and Maureen Rimmer. And we will shortly hear what the other researchers have to say about these results. But maybe, Carlos, is there maybe a question or two to Peter, which we could take, maybe a follow-up question?
Yes, thank you. There's a couple of very interesting questions. The first one is mostly a question for the panel discussion than for the in relation to the model work. However, it's very interesting, and it goes as follows. So, given the limited effect on employment on different age groups, plus the relative positive impact of the results on the primary sector, forestry. So how comes that there is substantial opposition among the people that might be, according to the model results, more on the winning side of climate policies? So that is the poorer, those living in rural areas, and particularly those that have unemployment in the forestry sector. So that could be a comment, maybe not so directly to Peter, but maybe he wants to ask something on our model results in relation to those groups of population. And then there's a second question that is more targeting the modeling work as such, that is posted by John Sudmeyer. Sorry, I didn't mention that the first one was by Kirsi Heikel. Sorry by my pronunciation. So this second question goes as follows. Doesn't the increase in forestry-derived products for the production of biofuel reduce the carbon sink provided by forests? How are these effects considered in the model? So these could be the two questions, both very good questions that perhaps Peter can take, in particular the second one, and maybe the first one is more a general question for the debate.
Yes, thank you, Carlos. Peter, would you like to comment something about the...
Yeah, very, very briefly. On the first one, well, I think all we can conclude is that people often don't know what's good for them. I mean, how is it that working people in the United States vote for Trump? What could possibly possess them to vote for a right-wing Republican Party opposed to all sorts of social services and so on? Okay, so it's an education problem, isn't it? Okay, and in our country, all right, we follow very high protection policies for years and years, right? And very high tariffs, and they were supported. Amazingly, they were supported by farmers who it took until the 1980s, and actually it took economic modelling of our type to gradually seep into the consciousness for farmers to realise that they were the big losers. This is a highly export-oriented industry. High tariffs on imports were really bad for them. It made the exchange rate high. It meant that they could sell less in international markets and so on. As soon as the tariffs came down, well, actually, the sad story is that as soon as the tariffs came down, something else happened, which was we had a mining boom. So the farmers, the exchange rate went up again, so the farmers were hurt again. But they would have been worse off with tariffs. So it's important that we keep on trying to educate people, right? So that they know what their best interests are. Okay, now the other question is a more technical question about forestry and carbon sinks. Well, as I understand it, the forestry products are a renewable resource. So if you use more forestry products, you grow more trees, and so it balances out. So that's as I understand it. But of course, there are almost certainly people here who know a lot more than I do about this particular topic.
Thank you, Peter. Maybe we can, if some of the other researchers would like to comment something about these questions, they are free to do so. But let's move on to what our researchers online have to say. Maybe I could ask you now to start with your comments in a nutshell. Maybe you could have a minute or two max time to tell us your first impressions. And Harry Flam, Professor Emeritus of International Economy from Sweden. Harry, could you please start your thoughts? Harry, your mic is perhaps not on.
Now, okay. First of all, I have to say that I'm impressed by the model itself. It's quite a feat to construct a model like this. I hope everybody will be aware of that fact. Second, I've been looking at the assumptions made. There are projections for how the Nordic economies will develop until 2030. It's necessary to make assumptions about growth, employment, investment, etc., to make these projections and the modeling exercises. And when you look at the assumptions, you realize that we are already somewhere in the middle of the modeling period, which is from 2019 to 2030. And so we can look at the assumptions and the actual numbers, and we can see that there's quite a discrepancy between, for instance, the assumptions about the growth figures. Now, this has to do with the pandemic mainly, but I noticed that the projections for Sweden are quite high compared to the other Nordic countries. So this, of course, is very important for the results that you get from the various policy experiments. And also, now, the policy experiments are mainly in the transportation sector. They have to do with mixing in biofuels, changing the mix of fuels, changing the share of electric vehicles, and phasing out coal-fired electricity production. Now, these are quite important aspects of the green transition, but there are other aspects that are also very important. For instance, the expansion of electricity production, changing over to wind and solar power, for instance, and the big investments that have to be made in industry, for instance, in steel making, in cement production, and so forth and so on. So, although it wasn't the task of the researchers here to analyze those policies, I look forward to future work with the model to try to analyze the other aspects of the green transition. So that's all for now.
Okay, thank you so much, Harry. And maybe we can go this round, and then Peter, if there's something you would like to say or comment, then it's of course your turn. But if we move on to advisory specialist Jóhannes, Bjarki Tómasson from Iceland's Environment Agency, and you work at the Department of Climate and Circular Economy. Go ahead.
Thank you. Sorry for my long title. Well, I really like the report. It outlines very well the climate policies in these respects for the Nordic countries. Of course, the Nordic countries are very similar. They have similar climate policies, but this, I think, highlights how the background scenario is different in the different countries. So the outcome can be very variable between the countries, even with very similar policies. And of course, saying this, I'm from Iceland, which is often the odd one out when it comes to Nordic models. It struck me that the cost of these policies is very low, and I think in the long term it's even lower. Of course, in some respects, I mean, like when it comes to motor fuels, the cost can be raised, but this is a short-term policy. In the long term, we are not going to rely as much on motor fuels as we do now. So this was very interesting. I think the gist of this report is that many of the climate policies are even economically beneficial. So even if you take climate change out of the picture, these would still be good policies. So I think we're on the right track when it comes to this. I would actually like to add one final note, which is outside the scope of this report, and that is that many of the policies that we are looking at now, they have positive impacts outside of climate change. It could be a better air quality or healthier nature or less food waste, but these benefits are there. They're not measured in the report, but they are there anyway. Thank you.
Thank you, Jóhannes, for your comments. And then Vincent Otto, Konjunkturinstitutet from Sweden. Your turn.
Yeah, I would also say that this is an important topic, and the further we progress towards our emission reduction targets, I think the more important this topic is going to become, because the costs will increase and the income inequalities will increase along the way. So this topic will become ever more important going forward. And then I also agree with Professor Flam that this is a solid model analysis. As a fellow modeler, I also appreciate the work that has been done. I like the Nordic scope, but I especially like all the detail regarding the labor markets, the various wage bands, the occupations, all the detail regarding the households, and also all the data effort that has been put in. Because it's one thing to model all of it, but you have to put numbers on all of these parameters, and that's a lot of work. So that I appreciate very much. And then I also have a note of consideration, or a note of caution, as you will. Again, Professor Flam was also a bit on the same topic. In this model analysis, it is assumed that we jump from 2019 to 2030, and then we have enough time to adjust. In the real world, of course, we will have quite a few adjustments to make. The emission reduction trajectory that we're on is rather steep. And that will lead to a lot of mismatches in the here and now and in the short term. For example, mismatches between where workers are and where they are needed. Mismatches in like power supply and power demand. All of these sectors in the model will rely on electrification, and transport is going to electrify to a large extent. So all that power needs to be supplied. But then I'm also thinking, for example, adjustment costs for households. So if we're all going to switch to electric cars, then we will also have all the second-hand cars with internal combustion engines that will lose value. And that will also directly affect the welfare of the households. So in the model world, it's quite often easy to analyze these shifts from long emission trajectories. But in the real world, it quite often is more painful than so.
Very good points. Thank you so much, Vincent Otto from Konjunkturinstitutet. So next one, Matthias Goldman, you're a founder of the Swedish Secretariat 2030. And if I've understood correctly, you're focused on transport issues. But what were your overall comments?
Well, my key conclusions here is that when Peter said that he was looking for a problem and didn't find one, well, here is one for you, Peter. And the problem is that what was shown as Sweden meeting its target is not going to happen. We now have a new government coalition in place in Sweden that decided against the targets and the incentives in place that were part of this investigation. And that shows also that some of the comments that we've already seen and heard here are correct. This story of this research from Nordregio is very important, but getting the facts out there is even more so important, because we see that policymakers in Sweden and also now in Norway, where subsidies or incentives for electric vehicles are being backrolled, the policy understanding of our policymakers is that it is much more expensive and that it has a much worse profile that in fact it does. So there's a clear need for this work to be spread, and it's getting worse because we just had a government commission that said that we should abolish the climate targets altogether from a Swedish perspective. We can rely solely on the EU targets. I think this clearly shows that would not be a great way forward, that in fact it is beneficial for a country to have the targets that have been mentioned here. My second and third points would be, secondly, that within the transport sector, we should factor in much more than just the fuel switch from fossil to renewable and to electromobility. We like to talk about bilen, bränslet, beteendet, so the behavioral switch also, which we're all participating in right now, just showing that there's no need to physically be at the same place just because we want to speak to each other. And the third one, that is more of a philosophical question, is that when Peter emphasizes that the changes are slight and not to be worried about, I think that a lot of us will see that as a missed opportunity, because clearly we need a change to a different kind of mobility. There's a very many different policy measures that should be taken, and that this opportunity it's a rare opportunity for us that we should use and not minimize the change that we can see in front of us, but in fact optimize them. For instance, the change of the workforce that now means that the major labor unions are now finally pushing for the switch from non-renewable to renewables shows that if we want, this is an opportunity not to minimize the change, but to optimize them. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthias. And let's take also Juha's comments as well. Juha Honkatukia from Finland, you've been a part of this research, but still this is also your expertise, these climate change policies, and Finland also has a new government, and it's been on the papers that Finland is not going to reach the climate targets with this government, but your overall thoughts, Juha.
Well, thank you, Kirsi. Thanks for the comments for colleagues. I'm sort of inclined to take on what Harry said about the focus and the fact that we didn't look into the electricity sector, not explicitly, but there is an increase in demand for electricity, which the modeling doesn't take into account. It's just that it's not modeled as an explicit policy in the sense that this other stuff is. But there was an idea that we would be focusing on things that are not covered by the European emission trade. So they would be beyond the realm of national policies. And transport, this is something that's kind of acute in all of the Nordic countries. So that was the background there. I thought it was really nice to sort of be part of digging into all this regional details and so forth. And obviously it's a policy issue in Finland as well. There seems to be some sort of an old economist of the macro type, they were talking about strawmen. So the strawman would be, in Sweden, it would be a agricultural worker or farmer driving a 1980s Volvo 240 Herrgårdsvagn. And then he would be the one that's hit. And we have something similar, maybe not driving a Volvo, but anyway, those would be the kind of people that politicians like to think are getting hurt. And I think the important thing of this sort of analysis is to show that it's not really true. So previously, in some studies that we conducted in Finland, we found that there is some mild form of progressivity if you just look at the effects of taxes. But here we are doing more than that. We're just assuming, taking a look at what the implication would be if the targets that the governments are more or less explicitly announcing were to be met. And we find that there is certainly any regressivity or progressivity in all of the policies. And if there is some, then this urban-rural distinction that we made, I think it's sort of it's background for a message for politicians that I would like to sort of be proposing, is that if you have losers all over this, then the effects on the economy as a whole are so small that it's not difficult to compensate for the losers. and then you have to do that if you want to sort of build any kind of political acceptance to the policies. Yeah, so that's actually my main take. But this occupation thing, I'm inclined to say that's given that the shifts in occupational demand for labor are so small, I think it's an important observation from the point of view that's one of the obstacles I think Vincent was mentioning, referring to, seems to be an idea that our skills are not adapting fast enough to the change that necessary. But if the occupational results are not that big, then I'm a little bit less worried about that's those lags in or sluggishness in this adjustment. So, but enough from me at this point. Thank you.
We continue with you too, but maybe Professor Dixon, if you would like to now say a few words for these comments. Maybe the overall comment is that a great model, a lot of work, highly respected, but then there is a real life, and the economical growth in Sweden has not been that sort of growth what was expected in 2019, and also inflation, etc. Maybe could you please put your mic on if that's the thing?
There we go. Good.
Thank you.
Sorry about that. Yeah, thanks for all those great comments. Yes, we shouldn't overestimate though the relationship between the policy results and the background baseline. Right, the baseline's there, but even if the baseline is a bit optimistic for Sweden, the orders of magnitude of the deviations are going to be pretty much right. Okay, so sure, these sorts of studies should be updated and worked on, and you know, new baselines put in place all the time. But the baseline assumptions are not terribly important for the deviation results. Right now, look, there are lots of good comments, but I think maybe I should concentrate on the real world and Vincent. Look, in the report, okay, we phased in the electric cars, right? We didn't scrap. There were no fossil what are they called, gasoline cars that were scrapped early. That they were all. It's a quite detailed analysis in the back there that you and I worked at. Remember you? Yeah. And so I think you shouldn't overestimate the adjustment costs there. All right. On electric power, sure, there was an increase, but we did take that into account. In fact, we had 5 types of electric production and so on, and there was extra investment in electricity and so on. So that was actually dealt with. What else is there? Okay, Jóhannes, yes, lots of, look, we're outlining the costs. The costs are negligible, right? This is a very frustrating thing. I've been working on these sorts of studies since the 1980s, actually. And in the very first one of these studies I worked on, to clean up electricity in Australia, it was thought that we would have to raise the costs of electricity by 50%, right? And this was a no-no. This was impossible. You couldn't possibly afford to raise the cost of electricity by 50%. But then think of the orders of magnitude. Electricity represented 3% of Australia's GDP. Raising it by 50% costs us 1.5% of GDP. Right? Now we're going to do it over a 20-year period. So we're going to phase it in over 20 years. So that, and Australia's GDP at the time grew by about 3% a year. So it meant that if we started our greenhouse policies back when we should have, back in the early 1990s, then we would have reached a certain standard of living in 2010, 20 years later, we would have had to wait until June for that standard of living instead of getting that standard of living in January. Now, come on, so it's so frustrating that the world is prepared to ruin our climate for when we could do something about it at absolutely at a cost which would not be noticeable. And it's so sad that in Sweden, Finland, they're the leading environmental countries, the tremendous records that the public gets fooled into thinking that you can't meet climate change targets because there's a war in Ukraine or something and the cost of oil has suddenly gone up and whatever, completely mistaking the causes and effects and all the rest of it, right? So it's our job as economists and as citizens to try to get these sorts of reports. This thing, I mean, I'm really pleased when I had to work on this thing with the Norwegian team, so it was terrific. But that's why these things are important, because we've got to get this sort of information accepted in the public domain. Otherwise, we won't make it, right? But we're going to have horrendous costs over the next few years in climate change.
Exactly. Luke, maybe we can shortly take a couple of questions on the transport sector and also household, but maybe just a simple question. How would you use this report, this research? And Professor Flam, can I ask you, is there some particular actions you see that these I could definitely take from this model and research and recommend for politicians or policymakers?
Who should go first?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Could you please start, Professor Flam? Harry.
Yes. Let me first say that I'm very confident, as Peter is, that I'm not very surprised at all that the effects, negative or positive, are very small. Considering the share of fuel costs, for instance, in consumption as an input in transportation industry and household consumption, we should not be surprised by the small effects. I'm familiar with Peter Dixon's work on tariff effects from the 1980s and 90s, and you always get these effects. Now, in Sweden, there is a question of what kind of instruments you want to use to achieve the climate goals. Sweden has national targets, as the other Nordic countries, for the transportation sector. And the whole model exercise is about those national targets. Now, the Fit for 55 package that the EU has passed now proposes another instrument for the transportation sector, namely a trade in permit system, as we have in other sectors. And that's another way to go. And so there are different ways, different ways that you can achieve the targets. So the policy experiment that was done in this study was using national targets that apparently we no longer have. And it seems that the present government is on its way to abandon. But if they are replaced by the EU-wide targets, the chances are that we will be able to achieve the targets. And I'm still confident that the cost in the transportation sector will still be very small, relatively, if you look at GDP growth and the change in GDP every year and so forth.
Okay. Jóhannes, can you also reply and tell your thoughts on the actions, how one could see, how would you like this research being used by the politicians?
It's a good question, and we already touched on this before. Like, if it's if there's a negligible cost following these policies, I mean, why aren't we doing this already? And why would the labor sector or be against these policies? I think a very interesting part of this report is that it's very reassuring for policymakers. Even working in the environmental sector, I wasn't really sure that these policies would be so economically feasible. So I think it's very, very reassuring. We can now more confidently roll out our action plans on climate change, I think. So I think that's a big take. Also, something that I've heard, a common rhetoric is that phasing out motor fuel power cars for electric vehicles would be very expensive for people in urban areas, and the benefits would be felt in rural areas, because rural areas spend more money on fuel, so they would save more by switching. But in the report, it's the vice versa. So it's mainly beneficial for urban areas, while the cost would be landed in the rural areas. So I think it's a very big take from the report. Thank you.
Matti, thanks. And Matthias, what would you say?
I'm worried that a lot of our dear friends, the policymakers, are not necessarily focusing on actual facts in these issues. I believe that we have a strong tendency to something akin to the anti-woke movement, where it's beneficial for many of our political friends to portray the switch to renewable energy, not least in Sweden, and the switch to electromobility as something that will benefit the people that are already well off, and that reverting to more of fossil fuels and less of electric car subsidies is something that is beneficial for the poor. This study clearly shows that that is not the fact, but we need to move away from the Excel files and into the realities of the everyday voter, where clearly the facts are on the table. That even though this report largely omits the costs of climate change and the costs of the deteriorating health associated with burning fossil fuels, those costs are primarily borne and taken by the poor people of Sweden, the Nordics, and the world. So there is clearly a pro-poor dimension, which is not dug into very much into this report, but that's where I would focus the most. And that is also before we focus on that, the jobs that will be created in moving from unsustainable imported fossil fuels to sustainable locally produced renewable fuels will largely be fairly low qualified jobs in the rural areas. Again, pro-poor. So my key take here from this report, but also more widely from the discussion that we see in all the Nordic countries, is that we need to change and win back the narrative, because the narrative now about fossil fuels is quite clearly false.
That's a really good point. A lot of work to do for all of us. I'd like to ask a couple of questions about household from Vincent and Juha, and then Carlos, if I could have a couple of questions from you. I know that there's some discussion going on, but about the households, Professor Dixon explained that the impact on households is small, but of course there are differences in households, and even a small increase may be a bigger stressor for some of the families, and also then the rural area, those who live there. What could the governments do to support and make this gap smaller one? Would you like to start, Vincent? Otto?
Yeah, well, I would say if these inequalities in these studies are indeed found to be small, then it should not be too difficult for policymakers either to compensate some households that are left behind. That is within the toolbox of policymakers. So I would look into that, like, how can I compensate? How could I compensate these households on the more rural parts of the countryside that have more difficulties to adjust. And also very practically, I would look into how can I help those households to adjust in terms of worker mobility, mobility between occupations, labor offices, and so. And when it comes to transport, I guess the rollout of charging stations is a clear priority. And relying on biofuels might be an option until battery capacities and the rollout of charging poles have caught up. So practically, that's what I would focus on.
Okay, and Juha Honkatuki, I know that this is your expertise.
Yeah, thanks. Well, Finnish politicians are also hard at work trying to damp the effects of the turbulence in the energy markets. And there was recently a nice study, rather a report by the Finnish Broadcasting Corporation, which was going after this. They want to compensate an estimated, I think it was something like to the tune of 5% increase in the price of fuel per liter by policies lowering the taxes and so forth. And then the show was about the price variation at the pump between Monday and Friday. And there was 20 or 30 cents increase in the price per liter starting from Wednesday and up to the weekend. And then Monday and Tuesday it was low. And then the point was that these policies are not very effective. So you can hardly measure what they're doing, but it seems to be important politically, and some parties are able to sort of sell this nonsense, if you will. Yeah, I don't think that it's a good idea to give up climate policies for the sake of the sorry things that are going on at the moment. The compensation thing, I think it's important, but at the same time, at least in Finland, I think it must be the same sort of a thing in most of the Nordic countries, is that quite a bit of these income redistribution measures, like pensions or subsidies to poor households and so forth, they are already indexed for the effects of inflation. And then what we found out that when the prices of energy were rising up, then it didn't really hurt pensioners that much, because they got pretty much full compensation for that, with a bit of a lag, but nonetheless. So the system is kind of already doing that, and I'm not sure. Something more could be done, but just the message that it's not necessarily the main thing to focus on. The job shift result is interesting. It's the green transition. It's enabling capital and energy intensive industries to keep on living. So it's actually, but without the emissions. But it's actually a shift away from this trend towards service economy or service-oriented economy, at least to some extent. And I'm finding that interesting. It's sort of working against what used to go for progress. Harry's idea or suggestion about the Fit for 55 package, I think that's right on the money. It used to be, we thought that there was a huge discrepancy between marginal cost of emission reductions in the trading or non-trading, in the transport sectors, in the non-trading sectors of the economy, versus the marginal cost in the emission trading sectors. And if that still applies, and I think to an extent it probably does, then the idea of integrating the transport sector within the sort of emission trading sector is a good idea, because it would take care of this problem. I mean, essentially, it's about the emission trading sector having too low a reduction target compared to the rest of the economy. And this rush for electricity in the transport sector is, I think, one example of how we have to deal with that sort of thing. But it's not without its problems, because essentially what we're doing is that we're sort of putting our eggs in one basket, and the same basket. The European Union used to does this all the time. They tell us you have to cut emissions, and then they tell us how to do that. So it's cut the emissions by investing heavily in battery-driven technology. But there are other technologies that might be, in the long run, more viable if they had room. So we're just crowding them out at the moment.
Well,
And I
thanks
think,
for this.
yeah, if I may, I just say
Yes.
that to me it's also interesting that the policy measures we have chosen in the Nordic countries are not exactly the same. I think Sweden has, I mean, to an extent, Norway has also gone more for market-oriented measures compared to Finland. Finland and Denmark have fixed numbers, but you guys have set the target and then leave it to the market and this on a period to get there.
Could be right. Carlos, would you have a question for the panelists or some of them?
Actually, Kirsi, most of the questions that were made on the chat were already addressed spontaneously. So essentially, the discussions were about these narratives and how to win this narrative in relation to climate policies and how they are communicated and buy-in by the population, and also in relation to these hidden costs that were not considered when it comes to the impact of climate change and fossil fuels in the first place. So these two issues were already addressed. And maybe there's only one comment also related to this mistrust on the public and the impact that is having on this sort of cultural war in relation to climate policies and how they are used by certain interests to actually push their political agendas. So all these are, well, issues that we should be reflecting about in the future. In particular, we want to promote this trustful and trustworthy information in relation to what climate policies, to how climate policies affect society.
Okay. Thank you, Carlos. Maybe we could finalize with some words about the next steps. We are almost all the Nordic countries are part of the European Union, and also, for instance, Norway is also a member, has accepted all the climate targets. But the European Commission is currently preparing its proposal outlining the EU's climate policy for the 2030s. And in the coming spring, in just a few months, the Commission will also give information about the 2040 targets. And the emission trading will also expand during this decade. So there's lots of things going on. But what about the Nordic countries and then within this bigger European Union frame? What could we do? Could we do more together there? Or how should we, if we think about the Vision 2030, which this research is part of, how should we, what could we do? Matthias, I'm looking at you.
Thank you for looking at me. I'm looking right back at you and at all the participants here and saying that what we're doing in the Nordics is hugely important and much more than we realize right now, because now we believe that there is European Union leadership, but I believe that might very well be just a snapshot of how it is right now. We have already seen that the Commissioner Timmermans is no longer there. We had a great speech of the Union from von der Leyen. She's soon leaving. When we have the European parliamentary elections in June, there will be, from a climate and sustainability perspective, much less benign parliament. And in less than a year from now, we will have a new European Commission that I doubt will follow up on what you just described. I believe that most of the things that we now take for granted are going to be either thrown out or at least diluted. And that means that when I see, for instance, Professor Jóhannes in Sweden or others advocating that there's no longer a need for Nordic cooperation or indeed for individual member states to move further, faster together and to keep the national targets and to keep the regional cooperation, I think that is plainly wrong. I think that we cannot rely on the European Union holding on to what we've seen as yet in the Fit for 55, much less can we rely on the European Union continuing to develop what we've recently been able to take for granted? And that means that this study is so relevant, and the work that we see from individual countries in the Nordic will be much more important than what we currently might realize.
Oh, thank you. The times we're living, it makes one wonder. But anybody else, would you like to add something? What we could do more together to speed up? Juha, would you like to say something?
Well, I understand the Nordic countries were leaders in creating something like international environmental agreements. It's often said that the protection agreement of the Gulf of Bosnia between Sweden and Finland was the first international treaty of its kind. So I think we just need to sort of keep on at it and follow, the great path that we have chosen before. In terms of the energy markets, Sweden, the Nordic countries were integrating the electricity market already in the 1990s, which was a huge step. And now that we have this immense increase in wind power, I think that integration is going to benefit us in the future as well. So we just need to sort of play up our strengths, I think. I think that's what Matthias was saying just as well.
Okay. Jóhannes, would you like to add something?
Yes, just a quick comment. The Nordic ministers have already agreed that we should be the most sustainable region in the world. So the world will be looking towards us regardless of what the European Union does. I think one of the conclusions from this report is that we can achieve our climate goals, or almost achieve our climate goals, without a structural disruption to our economies. But I know that many people are calling for a disruption, so I think we can even go further than what is included in this report. Thank you.
Yeah, I can perhaps also say something regarding the EU. As much as I see the same risks as Matthias regarding the EU going forward, I might perhaps not be as pessimistic, and I still think there is a lot of scope for Sweden and the Nordic countries to work together within the EU to keep the ambition level high, to secure that the Fit for 55 program is implemented, and to secure ambitious 2040 targets. Over and above, of course, I guess within the Nordic countries, we can work towards harmonizing our policy instruments as much as possible, and at least make sure that they don't contradict the EU targets and the EU policy instruments. Yeah, and that we learn from each other, that we learn from the Norwegians with their electric vehicle subsidies, that we learn from Sweden with its biofuel standards, etc. There's a lot of scope for cooperation going forward.
A very good point from learning from each other's. Professor Flam, would you like to say?
There's a very important difference between our national targets and the EU policy. The EU policy sets yearly targets for emissions. We have a target for 2030 and 2045. That's not very good in terms of goal attainment, because it's so easy to take it easy in the beginning of a period and then find that you can't reach the targets because there's too little time left. So the EU policy in this respect is superior to the Swedish national targets.
Thank you all for your comments, and Professor Dixon, I thank you so much for your research work and all the team that was involved. Thank you, researchers, modelers, and also for those who have joined our event today. We have lots to do. I wish all of you good luck with your future work. And this whole report we have just launched, you can find from Nordregio's website, and also please follow the project Ensuring Inclusive Economic Growth in the Transition to a Green Economy. There will be more reports and events to come. Thank you all. Have a great day, and also all the best.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.